Welcome to The WorkPlace, a podcast by CalChamber. I'm Matthew Roberts, Associate General Counsel for Labor and Employment with the California Chamber of Commerce. Hello, listeners. Election Day is fast approaching on November 5th, and even many California residents will be receiving ballots soon if you have not already received yours by the time you listen to this episode. As always, there are several statewide ballot measures that voters can weigh in on, and this year is one employment-related measure that we wanted to highlight here on the show, Proposition 32. In short, Prop 32 would raise the minimum wage for all California businesses, but the scale would differ a little bit based on whether the employer has 26 or more employees or not. So Prop 32's success would increase to $17 per hour for employers with 26 or more employees, and then move to $18 per hour on January 1st, 2025, where it'll stay through the end of 2026. For smaller employers with fewer than 26 employees, it would move to $17 per hour on January 1st, 2025, and then to $18 per hour on January 1st, 2026. And any subsequent years would see increases based on inflation, kind of like what we have now today. Now, if Prop 32 fails, then the minimum wage will still rise to $16.50 per hour on January 1st, 2025 for all employers, regardless of size, based on California's existing minimum wage law. So, to discuss the issues and concerns with Prop 32, we welcome two very special guests to join the show today. First, let's welcome Jennifer Barrera, President and CEO of the California Chamber of Commerce, to the show. Thanks for joining us today, Jennifer.
Thanks so much for having me, Matt.
Next, let's welcome Jot Condie, President and CEO of the California Restaurant Association. Thanks for being here today, Jot.
Hi, Matt. Thanks for having me.
All right, so let's just dive right into the meat and potatoes of this. Jennifer, the CalChamber has announced its opposition to Prop 32. Generally, in broad strokes, can you explain why that is?
Yes, we are opposed to Proposition 32, and our main concern really is, of course, the impact that this is going to have on businesses in California, especially our small businesses who are going to be hit with this automatic increase if the initiative is approved by the voters. And then we'll have to continue, obviously, to deal with that cost as the initiative is implemented over the next couple of years. And just like everybody else in California, our small businesses, our employers, they're struggling with high costs right now, and this increase will only add to those costs and create obviously some pressures with regards to their budget. The other side of this is, of course, the idea is for employees to get more money in their pocket. But our concern is with the cost pressure employers will be under as a result of this initiative, it could ultimately cost employees their job or even a reduction of hours. And so we have concerns, of course, from the employer impact, but also from the employee impact as well.
Great. And Jot, I know from reading through some of your materials that one of your primary concerns with Proposition 32 is really around increasing wage mandates like this through a ballot initiative process versus the regular legislative process, like how we arrive to our current minimum wage standard. So what's the concern you have around the process with Prop 32?
Well, first of all, that the putting a wage hike before the voters is typically not how it's been done in California. In fact, it's only been minimum wage hikes have only been before the voters once before in 1997, and that's for a reason. From the beginning of the establishment of California's minimum wage, the regular wage hikes have been through a deliberative process, typically through the Industrial Welfare Commission early on, but of course, recently it's been through an act of the legislature and or local governments, whether it's a county board of supervisors or a local city council. And in that process, both sides, the interest of the workers and the impacts on employers are taken into consideration, and they're usually arriving at a number that most of the time nobody's happy with, but they're considering the important impacts on the broader economy to avoid any turbulence in employment growth or inflation and so forth. The last minimum wage hike that was passed by the legislature and signed by Governor Jerry Brown had built in it these so-called off-ramps where if there were unforeseen economic circumstances or let's say a state budget deficit, then the governor would have the ability to hit the pause button and allow for sort of the economy to heal before the wage hikes would begin again. This initiative has no off-ramps. And if there are unforeseen economic circumstances that occur after, let's say, this were to pass, if it passes, there is no way to change it without going back to a vote of the people. So it's just an inefficient way to address adequacy of minimum wage.
Yeah, John, I think I agree with you. It's that more deliberative process through the legislative process that allows us to kind of account for some of the concerns that Jen just raised here. And to that end, I'll throw this question out to both of you, especially Jen, because you mentioned it. This increase would take place among a still ongoing inflation fight, and businesses continue to struggle to manage costs while avoiding pricing out consumers. How do you both see Prop 32's economic impacts, especially on small businesses who create millions of jobs here in California?
Yeah, I'll jump in on that real quick and then certainly turn it over to Jot for his input as well. But, the small businesses, well, when you're looking at anybody's budget, a small business or a larger business, there's only so many places that they can absorb the costs. And that's especially true, of course, for a smaller business who's operating on probably thinner margins sometimes. And so really, when you're looking at this, again, their costs are going to go up with their vendors, with their suppliers, and any of their supply chain, because those vendors and suppliers are also going to have cost increases, and they're going to pass that on to the consumer, who's the small business. So they're going to be having to absorb those cost increases, and then the direct hit to their budget with their labor costs going up, again, is another budget pressure. There's only, again, so many places that an employer can kind of offset those costs. One, as I mentioned before, is the unfortunate circumstance where they have to reduce their labor costs by reducing employee hours or ultimately reducing the size of their workforce. That's an unfortunate and, of course, unintended consequence. But then the other way in which they offset costs is through potentially higher prices to consumers. And so, again, if the ultimate goal of the minimum wage increase is to increase the purchasing power of some of these employees, that's not being achieved if ultimately it drives higher prices for consumers and they're in kind of the same cycle that they're in now. So we certainly have concerns from that perspective, especially on the small businesses who will have the hardest time absorbing these costs.
Yeah. The National Business Capital, which is a business lending company, recently reported data putting California at the top of the list, number one in terms of states that are feeling the sting of inflation. So we're already dealing with that in this state at a pretty extreme level. And if you look at what the New York Federal Reserve Bank probably a couple weeks ago came out and stated that the sharp prices in grocery store, cost price increases there were tied, in part to the sharp increases in wages that we've seen in that sector since 2019. So there's evidence that you start raising, creating price spikes for businesses and their operating costs, prices are going to go up or something has to give, and that seems to be where small business owners have to go. Largely because if you think about the minimum wage, just in the last 10 years, since 2013. The minimum wage has gone up every single year, with the exception of, I should say, 2015. But so this is the longest year over year scheduled minimum wage increase and the largest 78% increase, went from $9 to $16.50 an hour over the course of a decade. So every year, business owners are having to adjust and deal with that. So they're developing efficiencies, they're cutting costs where they can so they don't have to lay people off or increase prices. But this $2 spike or $1.50 spike in one shot, if this were to pass, is going to be devastating for employers. And ultimately, it will result in price increases. Certainly, we saw the evidence in the grocery store based on what the New York Federal Reserve Bank said. And then we're seeing this play out in real time in the fast food sector, where the fast food law passed and took effect in April. And social media is awash with rants about the price spikes in the fast food sector of the restaurant industry. So if the minimum wage goes to $18 because of Prop 32, we're likely to see some similar type of impact across the board at the dry cleaners, at retail trade, at your shoe store, at the beauty salon, everywhere.
Great, John. I'm actually really glad that you mentioned the fast food worker minimum wage because this increase, Prop 32, isn't really happening in a vacuum of increases, right? This isn't the only one that we've looked at either this year or in prior years. We have geographic and sector-specific increases across the board. We have the imposition of nearly 40 local minimum wage ordinances. We have 2 statewide sector-specific increases, the fast food worker minimum wage we talked about that took effect April 1st of this year, and then the healthcare worker minimum wage, which will take effect at some point later this year, October 15th or maybe a little bit beyond that. And what I want to take from and dive deeper into this is what are the lessons that we're learning on the negative impacts of those actual wage increases that we've seen as a lesson that we might see coming out of Prop 32?
Boy, lots of lessons, and they're happening every day. But to your point about these sort of regional differences, I mean, California isn't just one large economy; it's a cluster of a lot of microeconomies. The economy in the Silicon Valley is much different than in the Central Valley. And what we're seeing, just in terms of, let's say, this fast food law, for example, we're finding that the business owners, fast food franchisees in, the Silicon Valley have a much easier time, passing the cost along to the customer than franchise owners do in the Central Valley, right? Because the economy is different. That's why we've seen, just over the last decade or so, a lot of municipal governments, that deal with extraordinary high costs of living, like San Francisco, for example, that's already at $18 an hour. They raised the minimum wage there to address their very unique, economic climate. And so, a statewide $18 minimum wage is going to have a much different impact for businesses in the Bay Area than it will for businesses in, let's say, the Central Valley or the Inland Empire or Eastern Sierra region of California or Northern California. So this new fast food law is sort of giving us a glimpse into the impacts that this will have on small businesses in other sectors as well.
And Jennifer, what have you been hearing around kind of the same issues? As a statewide advocacy organization for all businesses, the local minimum wage, especially the patchwork all over the place, has made administration just a minimum wage difficult on its own. But what are some other things that you've heard that have been more difficult for our members, especially in areas with higher minimum wages?
Yeah, I mean, the patchwork is a challenge because, of course, we are a state in which everybody doesn't just operate within that micro region, as Jot was referencing, and so many of our labor laws are tied, of course, to the hourly rate and what employees are being paid by the hour. So when they cross over different regions of the state, it makes an employer who is operating throughout the state the tracking very challenging and difficult. But aside from that, I mean, the other reference, an example that I would point to is, of course, when West Hollywood kind of approved their minimum wage, which is one of the higher ones in our state, you immediately saw the outcry from the small businesses in that region who basically said, we can't afford this and we are not going to be able to kind of absorb this cost. And what was interesting to me with the West Hollywood minimum wage increase was that the city even recognized, of course, that would be a difficult cost for those small businesses to potentially absorb, and gave them an off-ramp, as Jot had mentioned earlier, to say, hey, do you need like a delay on this increase going into effect? Apply, for kind of an exemption, so to speak. So they even had a process in place, recognizing, again, that this could be devastating to some small businesses. And we don't have that same off-ramp here with regards to this minimum wage. So I think, it kind of just summarizes everything that we've been talking about. The process is not ideal for having a consideration of a minimum wage increase of this type. It needs to be a more deliberative process where you can take into consideration really the economic impacts this is going to have on those businesses, especially small businesses, and give them kind of their opportunity to voice it. And we just don't have that opportunity with this ballot initiative.
Excellent. Well, Jot, as a leader of the trade organization representing our restaurants up and down the state, is there anything else, especially related to your sector, that you'd like our listeners to know today about Prop 32?
Well, I think there's a unique impact. Well, there's several unique impacts. I mean, the restaurant industry is, known as an industry of first opportunities, for young workers, inexperienced, first-time workers. And an interesting fact that was brought to my attention by Chris Thornburg of Beacon Economics, who put out a paper, several weeks back, that highlighted this unusual youth unemployment rate that we have in California. California's economy is doing fairly well, but the unemployment rate is 5%, which is a point higher than the rest of the country, which is sort of an anomaly in and of itself. But when you look inside that number and you find out what's driving that 1% difference between California and the rest of the nation, he teased out the fact that 90% of workers who have lost their job in the last 24 months are under the age of 24. And the unemployment rate for teens is 20% in California, which is double the national average. And they basically said there's a direct correlation between the last decade of year-over-year minimum wage increases and where we are now, right? Where minimum wage increases, as they've gone up, historically, usually every 3 to 5 years in increments, the impacts, there's less turbulence, to the economy when, businesses have a time to absorb the impacts. After a decade-long run of minimum wage increases, we're seeing very real consequences here. And for an industry that prides itself in hiring first-time workers and giving people that very important first job, we're seeing those opportunities slip away for a workforce that needs a job probably more than most.
And Jennifer, here at the Chamber, we like to focus with an eye on our legislation towards, is this a bill that might have a kind of job killer aspect to it? And of course, we have our job killers list that we talk about every year. And a lot of things that you and Judd have been talking about have some of the hallmarks behind that. So Jen, do you have any final words for our listeners here around Prop 32? Again, why we oppose it and why they should really strongly consider voting no on this ballot initiative?
I think, of course, I'll just reference again the cost pressures that this puts on businesses. And I know we've been talking a lot directly about that hourly increase, but what all listeners know and should be reminded of is that our exempt salary basis test here in California is directly tied to our minimum wage. So anytime the minimum wage increases, that minimum salary that you have to pay exempt employees also increases. And so it's a cost pressure on multiple layers throughout the employer's workforce. It's, of course, employees who are being paid the minimum wage, but also it will put cost pressures to boost everybody else up because they will want to be elevated, of course, above that hourly rate. And then your salaried employees, of course, will also see an increase. And so it is a broader cost impact than just that, increase to the minimum wage. It really does put cost pressures across the entire workforce. And as we talked about, all of those cost pressures will be the same for suppliers and vendors of that business and kind of doubles down on what those impacts are to the employer. So we have significant concerns from that perspective. Jot mentioned the unemployment rates here in California. We're very sensitive to that, of course. Employers aren't going to, go to that as their first way to deal with these cost increases, but it is one of the things that they have to evaluate is how they offset the costs they're going to feel as a result of this initiative. And so we just really have a concern, again, from that impact to the employers, the cost potentially to consumers, and the unintended consequences to the labor and workforce who may, be reduced hours or even lost jobs as a result of it.
And Jennifer, I'm so glad you made that point about the exempt salary because we've actually seen that in practice with the fast food worker minimum wage, right? That started at $20 an hour starting on April 1st this year. And that meant that your exempt employees within the fast food restaurants that are covered by that law are making more than $80,000. And in a small margin business like that, you can see how devastating that might be for those kind of businesses. And now we're looking at expanding that broadly to really all businesses across the state. Jennifer, Jot, thank you so much for taking some time out of what I'm assured is a very busy schedule for both of you. And thank you for advocating for California businesses to talk this issue with Prop 32 out with me. So again, thank you both for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Matt.
Thanks, Matt.
And thank you, listeners, for joining this discussion on the workplace. As always, please share and subscribe to CalChamber's podcast by visiting calchamber.com.